Chapter 16 of J.S. Bach. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Music performed by Jonathan Schofield. J.S. Bach by Albert Schweitzer. Translated by Ernest Newman. Chapter 16. The performance of the clavier works. The ordinary player of Bach finds the ornamentation one of the greatest difficulties. It is a book with 7 seals to him. In reality, the question is by no means so complicated as it appears at first sight. We must start from the explanations which Bach himself gives on the 3rd page of Friedemann's Orgelbewegung, 1720, under the heading Explanation of diverse signs showing how to play certain ornaments neatly. Bach elucidates each sign by writing out in full the manner of playing it thus: trill, mordant, trill and mordant, cadence, double cadence, item, double cadence and mordant, item, accent ascending, accent falling, accent and mordant, accent and trill, item. In addition, there is the essay on Manieren, ornaments, in Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's Versuch über die wahre Art das Klavier zu spielen, essay on the true way of playing the clavier. The main rules to be observed are the following. 1. Bach indicates the trill simply by the signs T, Tr, without specifying every time the particular manner or duration of it. As a rule, it occupies the whole or the greater part of the note value. 2. The trill begins as a rule with the upper accessory note, and only in exceptional cases with the principal note. In long trills, it is desirable first of all to linger a moment on the principal note, and then begin the trill with the adjoining note, especially when a movement or a theme, see, for example, the F-sharp major fugue in the second part of the Well-Tempered Clavichord, commences with a trill, or when the upper note has just been struck. 3. The Bach trill is further distinguished from the modern trill by the fact that it must be played much more slowly. It is spoiled by being taken quickly. We must bear in mind that the trill sign over a quaver signifies nothing more than it must be decomposed into 2 parts of easy demi-semi-quavers. In the same way, a crotchet, if the tempo be somewhat fast, will be simply split up into 2 pairs of semi-quavers. The ornament is best realized when we play it with almost an exaggerated deliberation. 4. If the succeeding note is a descending second, then the trill sign as a rule indicates not an ordinary trill, but a Pralltriller. This must be carefully observed. Bach writes the trill with a Nachschlag afterbeat, thus trill, mordant, conceiving it as a trill with a mordant. The downward and upward Vorschlag, preliminary grace note, are denoted by crooks of a similar kind but reverse direction, double cadence, and item. Trills with Vorschlag and Nachschlag, double cadence and mordant, have both signs, thus double cadence and mordant, and item. The manner of performance is explained by Bach himself in the above-mentioned examples in Friedemann's Orgelbewegung. According to Emmanuel, long trills must always have a Nachschlag, but this is dispensed with when several trills follow each other. The sign trill before a descending second thus signifies a Pralltriller, that is, a broken trill. It must be played much faster than the ordinary trill. The final note of it must, to use Emmanuel's expression, be filliped, by which he means that the key must be struck quickly and then jerked up again by an equally rapid drawing inwards of the point of the finger, which gives the note a very marked accent. Thus, partita fo aria. In the case of a practiced player, Emmanuel recommends a prolongation of this Pralltriller by 1 or 2 extra notes. His view of the Pralltriller is that it is simply a very rapid trill of longer or shorter duration, which is suddenly cut short on the staccato main note in such a way that the whole purpose of the trill seemed to be merely the throwing of a weightier accent on this note. The mordent, also denoted thus trill, is an interrupted trill, in which it is less a matter of the number of notes trilled than of throwing the accent on the main note that cuts the trill short. Unlike the prol triller, it is not limited to any particular situation. It takes the next note below, and is thus, as it were, the inverse of the prol triller. Both in Emmanuel's phrase glide into the second, the mordent above, the prol triller below. We may distinguish the two chief forms of the mordent, a short and a long. The latter has generally two constituent notes. It can also be presented by the prolonged sign. Mordents have a preference for the major second. French suite, sarabande in E flat major. The turn in Bach's music, denoted thus, must as a rule be played in 4 equal notes, in accordance with a note in Friedemann's book. A longer duration may, however, be given to the principal note if the tempo is not too quick to allow of this. Thus, or. The Vorschläge, appoggiature, indicated by slurs or small notes, are sometimes long, sometimes short. In each case, however, the accent falls on them, not on the principal note. The latter is tied with them and struck lightly. Emmanuel calls this the Abzug, pulling off. If the Vorschlag is long, it takes half the value of the following note, if equal division is possible. If not, 2/3 fall to the Vorschlag. Thus, or. This rule, however, is not to be rigorously adhered to, but must be interpreted with reasonable regard to the requirements of the rhythm at the moment. The Vorschlag before a long note is generally long, and that before a short or passing note is generally short. Yet here again everything depends upon the position and the significance of the note. According to Emmanuel, a Vorschlag that takes the interval of a third is always short, even before a long note. The examples are very instructive in which the long and the short of Vorschläge are met with the same work, as in the Sinfonia in E flat major and the Sarabande from the Partita in G major. Here the Vorschläge on the second and third beats of the bar are best rendered short, and those on the first beat long. Thus, Sinfonia in E flat, to be played Partita 5, Sarabande, to be played The more we study the nature of the Bach Vorschlag, the more we see that the actual note values are a matter of indifference, and that the real questions are the weight and the energy of the accents. As he always writes the accent as an abbreviation of the note, such passages as these only attest that the first note must have a strong accent, while the second must be tied to it and have a diminuendo. The time values of the notes must be as if written thus. Conversely, quavers or semi-quavers grouped in pairs must always be played in such a way that the second is only a kind of after-breath of the first and sustained for only a fraction of its time value. The tie is thus simply an accent mark. The Nachschlag, indicated by a crook appended to the note or by small notes, is always short, and must merge into the note that follows. Thus, when Bach writes the following 2 examples, it must be played as if written thus. When, as in the Courant of the first Partita, he writes This is merely the old inexact method of notation for all through his work we find him using the dot in the old way, that was more summary than exact. These explanations of Bach's Manieren can only be regarded as general rules for the average case. If the ornaments accumulate, we soon exhaust the art of explanation and are thrown back upon our sense of natural euphony as the last authority. This is also Philipp Emanuel's view. After pursuing the casuistry of the rendering of ornaments into its final subtleties, in the end he submits the decision to artistic feeling, and so disowns the scholasticism at which he has been so seriously labouring all the time. Anyone who has made himself familiar with the fundamental principles of Bach's ornamentation will find, by a little reflection, a satisfactory solution of the difficult rhythmical and tonal problems involved. He must always bear in mind that the reason for the ornaments being indicated by signs, instead of written out in notes, is that he may have a certain freedom in the embellishment of the design. If we can get out of some of the beaten tracks of modern piano playing and acquire a sense of the formal principles underlying the old ornamentation, we shall have achieved a good deal. The question of whether we shall ever agree upon an interpretation of the numerous ornaments in the aria of the Goldberg variations will then be nearer a satisfactory answer. Closely considered, the whole system of ornamentation of that epoch indicates the partial surrender of the composer to the virtuoso, who wanted to make his own effect by adding freely to the music. During the last century and a half, we have slowly moved away from this conception of the role of the executant artist. The first to set his face against it was Bach himself. He could not combat his critic Scheiber's reproach that he left nothing to the player, but wrote out in full what had been formally indicated by signs. The reproach is just. As a matter of fact, Bach banishes ornaments from his music. In the well-tempered clavichord, we practically never meet with them. Even a bravura piece like the Italian concerto is almost destitute of them. In his vocal music, again, they are almost wholly dispensed with. His music certainly seemed bare to his contemporaries. Only in the gallant genre, the suite, does he allot the ornaments a role, which, however, is very trifling in comparison with what was customary at the time. There is thus a certain irony in the fact that the small amount of ornamentation in his work should give such trouble to the average player of today. This is, however, his own fault, not Bach's. Anyone who will devote 4 or 5 hours to getting a clear idea of the main points here discussed will find that the works have lost their terrors for him, and in the end he will find these Manieren a source of pleasure. The question whether our modern piano is the right piano for Bach does not as yet occupy the general public very seriously, as it can form no conception of the instruments Bach used. In more expert circles, however, the question is already being debated with some heat. What would be Bach's attitude towards the modern piano? Exactly the same as towards the modern organ. He would hail with enthusiasm the perfection of its mechanism, but not be particularly enchanted with its tone qualities. Sebastian Erard's invention in 1823 of the repetition action made possible on the hammer clavier the finely gradated touch that caused Bach to prefer the weak clavichord to the full-tone cembalo. Henceforth, however, it was towards greatly increased strength of tone that attempts to perfect the piano were directed. The more powerful the tone became, the duller became the timbre, so that the piano of today no longer suggests in any way the tone of the instrument of Bach's time, the result of substituting an iron resonance for the clear and bright wood resonance. The duller of the timbre of an instrument, the less suitable it is for polyphonic playing, in which each voice must stand out clearly from the others and be always perceptible by the hearer without effort. How unsatisfactory our piano is in music with bold obbligato parts like those of Bach only become evident after we have heard a few preludes and fugues on a good clavichord or clavicembalo. The clavichord is a string quartet in miniature. Every detail comes out lucidly on it. On the cembalo, every melodic line is quite clear, the plucked tone having a much sharper quality than that of the modern piano. Whether, however, it is advisable to posit a return to the old instruments as imperative for the true enjoyment of Bach's clavier music is doubtful. The clavichord is put out of court at once, for we could never again accustom ourselves to so weak a tone. It is otherwise with the cembalo. The charm of its sparkling and rustling tone is not so easily resisted, and the variety of tone that it permits by means of change of keyboards, coupling, uncoupling, and octave coupling almost makes us forget that no nuance of tone is possible on it. The bass part, too, comes out more clearly and beautifully on the cembalo than on any other instrument. Anyone who has heard Frau Wanda Landowska play the Italian concerto on her wonderful Pleyel clavecin finds it hard to understand how it could ever be played again on a modern piano. But even in a quite small concert room, the cembalo fanatic's enthusiasm has to contend against the unfortunate fact that at a distance of about 25 feet, the tone that is so rustling when heard at close quarters becomes somewhat feeble and tremulous. Nor do all Bach's work sound equally well on the cembalo. It is best for pieces of unbroken and uniform motion, those that, like the C major prelude of the second part of the Well-Tempered Clavichord, consist of arpeggio-like broken chords, and particularly those in pure two-part form, like the A minor prelude from the second part of the Well-Tempered Clavichord. On the other hand, the abruptness of its tone and its inability to sustain a note make it unsuitable for music that demands a singing quality of tone. The reconstructed cembalo thus seems better fitted for Bach's music in private circles and for certain of his works than to impress the general public with the clavier compositions as a whole. Nonetheless, all lovers of Bach owe their gratitude to the scholars, artists, and instrument makers who have again brought the cembalo in honor among us, and it is to be hoped that the instrument will be more used for Bach playing. On the other hand, we must not imagine that the cry of "back to the cembalo" solves the problem of which instrument we should play Bach upon. For the moment, we can only be sure that the modern piano is not so close in character to the one Bach dreamed of as Spitta and his contemporaries thought it was. This is evident from the peculiar demands made by Bach's works, and a certain toning down is already beginning to be noticeable in the modern piano. We are gradually realizing that the excessively strong and blunted tone of our grand pianos may be necessary for a large concert room, while in a small music room in a house it is too deafening to be pleasing, and that we must combine our consummate mechanism with a fabric of such a kind that the tone shall again be bright and clear and metallic. When this has been properly realized, and we have again reproduced in perfection the type of the table piano of 1830, as we have done with the cembalo, then we shall be much nearer the solution of the question which piano we ought to play Bach upon, at any rate at home. Until then, anyone who would rather play Bach beautifully than powerfully must be content with a well-restored table piano of 1830 or 1840. But the problem will not be wholly solved even by a reform of the domestic piano, for the reason that Bach had two instruments in his mind's eye. The modern piano is suitable for the music of the clavichord type, while the pieces calculated for the cembalo come out in their true beauty only in the silvery tone of that instrument. As regards the interpretation of the clavier works, opinions are gradually become clearer. When Liszt and Billau, in the middle of the 19th century, undertook to show the public again the living Bach, they had to fight a tradition that made stiffness, pedantry, and absence of temperament the true requisites for Bach playing. We can therefore easily understand their falling into the other extreme, and thinking that if Bach was to speak intelligibly to us, he must be born again in the spirit of modern virtuosity. This was the origin of those Bach arrangements and Bach interpretations that aimed at modern effects, in which the aim was not so much to bring out the laws of the works themselves as to make Bach talk like a modern. Later on, Billau himself went astray in his Bach editions. That of the chromatic fantasia was a typical case, trying to give the public a simpler idea of Bach's work than the composer had. What he was dimly striving after came into clear consciousness in a later and more reflective generation of pianists that had learned to look at Bach's work as a whole. Two typical representatives of this new school are Busoni and Viana da Motta. These and the others who see eye to eye with them do not aim so much in their Bach playing as ingenious dynamic nuances or striking effects as on making the broad plastic lines of the work speak for themselves. Bach is an organist rather than a clavierist. His music is more architectonic than sentimental. That is to say, his feelings express themselves in a kind of acoustic design. As in his organ works, so in his clavier works, there is little of the imperceptible merging of the piano into forte and vice versa. A certain strength of tone dominates a whole period, and is followed by another of a contrasted intensity of tone. Bach's music is always more or less majestic, says Viana da Motta. It always rises in broad terraces like the primitive Assyrian temples. It is this structure that we must look for if we wish to understand a given work thoroughly. Otherwise, we shall always come to it with an arbitrary conception of our own and try to force it into conformity with this. We must begin with a study of the clavier works in which Bach himself has indicated forte and piano. These are the Italian concerto, the chromatic fantasia. If we can rely on the copies here, and the last partita in B minor, These shew us on what very simple lines Bach conceived the structure of a work. The contrasting periods are very long. A change only occurs when there comes a salient episode of a different kind. Even in the echo piece at the end of the partita, the contrasts are not lavishly employed. This very partita, however, shews us that in many works Bach did not calculate on any variation of tone strength. After having made use of the two keyboards in the overture, he adopts only one color for all the other numbers. On the other hand, it is obvious that the majority of the long introductions to the English suites and the partitas demand two-tone colors, and are built on the same plan as the overture to the last partita. In the prelude to the English suite in G minor, the piano begins at bar 33 and continues to bar 67. Then comes a forte passage, lasting to bar 99. From this point, the hands play for some bars on different keyboards, the one that has the flying quaver motive derived from the main theme being each time on the forte manual. To bar 125, both are on the main manual. The succeeding piano passage lasts until bar 161, where the right hand goes to the forte manual, while the left stays on the soft manual. In bar 185, this hand also goes to the forte. It is important that in the pieces noted by Bach with forte and piano, we should be quite clear how he goes from one tone tint to the other, sometimes with both hands at once, sometimes with one following the other. In this connection, the organ works should again be studied, which, being laid out on larger and simpler lines, exhibit the terraces much more clearly. Nor should the Brandenburg Concerto be forgotten. They are most illuminative as the structure of Bach's works and the employment of different degrees of strength of tone. We must consider, too, that in the orchestral suites called overtures, BG 31, Bach indicates changes only for the introductions and the free movements, but not for the dances. This accords with the principles exhibited in the last clavier partita. With the information thus acquired, we have some sort of a guide as to the dynamic plan underlying the preludes and fugues of the well-tempered clavichord. Here again, there are a number of pieces, among both the preludes and the fugues, that are intended to be played in one color throughout. Where the character of the architecture shows no logical necessity for change, where consequently alterations of forte and piano seem arbitrary, it is better to maintain an agreeable and flexible forte. For example, the preludes in C sharp minor, D minor, and E major from the first part. In the fugues, we shall still more frequently have the conviction that they are not planned for dynamic variety. In the pieces that employ 2 degrees of strength of tone, these degrees are either distributed simultaneously between 2 voices or they alternate. To the first order belong the preludes in D minor, A minor, and B minor from the second part. Here the proper dynamic is to bring to the front each time the voice that has the main theme, while the other voice remains more in shadow, as it were. Many preludes are laid out in such a way that the one hand always plays piano, the other always forte, as it is prescribed in the middle movement of the Italian concerto. A typical specimen of this is the 3-part prelude in F sharp minor from the second part, which is written in such a way that the left hand plays the lower voices and the right hand the upper voice alone. To play now forte, now piano, here would be as wrong as to do so against Bach's express specifications in the middle movement of the Italian concerto. The clue to the distribution of light and shade in the A-flat major and A major preludes from the first part is given by the entry of the theme. Wherever it appears, whether in one part alone or in the ensemble, it must be given out forte. The rest must be kept piano. In the F minor prelude of the second part again, that is so often maltreated. The variations of forte and piano are unequivocally determined for the first section at any rate by the entry of the main theme. In the second section the matter is less clear, theme and episode not being so clearly marked off from each other. The most natural way of playing it would be thus: bars 1, 4½ forte, 4½ to 8½ piano, 8½ to 16½ forte, 16½ to 20½ piano, 20½ to 32½ forte, 32½ to 40 piano, 40½ to 46½ right hand forte, left piano, 46½ to 52½ vice versa, 52½ to 56½ piano, then forte to the end. The prelude in C major from the first part seems to be calculated on an echo effect of the kind obtainable on two manual cembalo. The first part of the bar should thus be played forte, the second half piano. In this way it sounds exquisite on the cembalo. The prelude has then the effect of a cheerful reverie, instead of the pathetic effect we are apt to read into it when we try to bring out the mysterious melody that seems to hover above it. If we play it pathetically on our pianos with a big and continuous crescendo, the effect is unsatisfactory, no matter whether this finishes in a fortissimo or, contrary to Bach's clear intentions, dies away to a pianissimo, if indeed it has not done this several times already. The one thing we can be sure of with regard to the modern way of interpreting this prelude is that there has never yet been a pianist who has succeeded in playing it to the satisfaction of another. The D major fugue in the first part, which is more on the line of a fantasia, makes its natural effect when we play the main theme, the upward striving demi-semiquaver figure, forte each time it occurs, contrasting it with the calm downward moving semiquaver figure which must be played piano. In this way the powerful final climax becomes particularly effective. In the D minor prelude from the second part, again, the descending answer to the ascending fanfare-like theme should contrast with this by being taken piano. If we are to play this prelude in accordance with the sense of it, we must conceive it as scored for Bach's orchestra. On closer examination, we shall discover only a few quite short sections that are to be given in the piano tint. These short piano interludes are very characteristic of Bach, as we see from many examples among the organ and orchestral works. Their very brevity makes them doubly effective. In the majority of pieces, however, these episodes are to be recognized only from their structural plan, and not as contrasts inherent in the theme itself. It is safest to be guided by the cadences and the incidents of the polyphony. If the segment is preceded by an important cadence, or if one or more voices are resting, then it is a fair assumption that the passage in question is to be played piano. The E major fugue from the second part may serve as an example. Bars 1 to 22 forte, 23 to 34 piano, 35 to the end forte. The E flat major fugue for the same part is similarly laid out. Bars 1 to 30 forte, 30 to 58 piano, but with the theme given out forte, 59 to the end forte. The C sharp minor fugue from the first part calls for a similar treatment. For increases of intensity within the forte, Bach realizes only secondarily on dynamic means. He builds up the effect by the fullness of his tone and the way in which the voices cooperate. The evidence for the inner necessity of a change to piano is not always so clear as this. As a rule, we have to be satisfied with a certain amount of probability. For example, when in the F major fugue for the second part we begin the piano at bar 29 and let it cease in the left hand in the second half of bar 66, in the middle voice in the right hand in bar 70, and in the upper voice in the second half of bar 73, or when in the G minor fugue of the first part we end the forte at bar 12 1/4, taking the following bars piano, only bringing out the theme forte wherever it occurs, and let the final tutti begin at bar 28, or when in the C major fugue for the first part we begin the piano at bar 14 and let it continue until bar 24, or when in the D major fugue from the second part we play forte until bar 16, piano until 27 and then bring in the final tutti. With many preludes and fugues, however, our efforts are in vain. We can discover in them no dynamic plan that could not equally well be replaced by another, and our only recourse is to bring out the theme and avoid marked contrasts. As an example, we may cite the F minor fugue from the second part. In the G minor fugue from the second part, it is clear enough that the final tutti begins with bar 67, but it is not so clear how far back the previous piano extends. One is tempted to begin it in bar 40. It is a false modernization to let a cadence that ends a forte section die away in a diminuendo so as to lead over into the following piano, or to make a crescendo at the end of a piano section in order to glide imperceptibly into the forte. In this way, we level the terraces on which everything depends in these works and destroy the plastic outlines of the piece. The Bach cadence is something solid, and must be given out in the normal tone of the section which it concludes. It is this stark antithesis that gives the music its charm, as can be seen in the Brandenburg concertos. The tutti voices suddenly cease, and the concertino of the solo voices, after having entered on the last chord of the tutti, remain suspended, as it were, in the air. It is another false modernization to begin or end pianissimo, just as in a pianoforte piece that Bach himself has marked, or in a Brandenburg concerto, or in an organ work, we have to begin and end in a forte. We must so begin and end in the pieces of the well-tempered clavichord. This rule will not at first be acquiesced in by players who think in the modern pianistic way. It will strike them as pedantic. Nevertheless, the longer we play Bach, the more we revolt against artificialities and clevernesses of every kind, and feel that the simplest way is the only right one. Some day we shall even dare to begin and end the E-flat minor and B-flat minor preludes from the first part in a beautiful but full-toned color, and to conceive them largely and pathetically, instead of delicately and sentimentally as we do now. In the E-flat minor prelude, all the chords, whether they lie above or below, should be taken piano, while everything that pertains to the eloquent theme, including the cadences, should be taken forte. In the B-flat minor prelude, we should begin with a vigorously shaded forte, take bars 13 and 14 piano, then begin again with a quiet forte that works up until 3 bars before the end, the final cadence being taken in a quiet forte. A further fault that is likewise ground in the pianistic feeling of our time consists in sacrificing everything in a fugue to the working out of the theme, and, as soon as this enters, clapping the hand as it were over the mouth of the other obbligato voices, the result being that the auditor hears the theme, but not the fugue. In episodical passages it is natural to play the theme, whenever possible, on a separate manual, as it were, but in the logical opening and final structure of the fugue, all the obbligato voices have equal rights, and the theme can only be considered as primus inter pares. From the foregoing it is evident that on the piano, as on the organ, it is wrong to begin a theme pianissimo and then work it up through a continuous crescendo to a final fortissimo, as if we were first presenting it as a cub, and then showing it in all the stages of its development until it becomes a lion. Every Bach theme, whether it expresses joy or grief, has a touch of the sublime about it, and it must be delivered in this style from the beginning. It must be confessed, though, that it is difficult for us modern musicians to emancipate ourselves from the idea of working Bach gradually up to a final climax. There are still many artists who think that the essence of the fugue in general, and of Bach fugue in particular, consists in a gradual pulling up from piano to fortissimo. The laws here laid down for the plastic performance of Bach's music are not derived from tradition, but are grounded in the works themselves. They attest that nothing is gained by besprinkling his compositions with pianissimo, piano, mezzo forte, forte, fortissimo, crescendo, and decrescendo, as if they were written for the accordion, but that we must aim either at the working out of a broad dynamic plan, or decide to play the work with a uniform strength of tone. This view can seem pedantic only to those who think that it elevates monotony to an artistic principle. The opposite is really the case. When the one quality of tone is distributed over a segment, large or small, it must be richly shaded in detail, but in such a way that these shadings do not overstep the limits of that particular degree of tone. Bach loved the clavichord so much precisely because he could produce this shading of detail on it, and the magic of his playing for his contemporaries came from his vivacity of detail. We must therefore distinguish in his music between an architectonic dynamic that aims at bringing out the great lines of the piece, and the dynamic of detail that accompanies it, the object of which is to give life to these lines. The latter could almost be styled a declamatory dynamic, being somewhat analogous to the cadential element in the musical speech. Bach's music is Gothic. Just as in Gothic architecture, the great plan develops out of the simple motive, but enfolds itself in the richest detail instead of in rigid line, and only makes its effect when every detail is truly vital. So does the impression of a Bach work makes on the hearer depend on the player communicating to him the massive outline and the details together, both equally clear and equally full of life. If in place of this dual architectonic dynamic we put the uniform modern emotional dynamic such as we meet with in Beethoven's works, we have simply done our best to make Bach unintelligible by confounding the great and the small nuances in one. Therefore, to play the prelude in E-flat minor and B-flat minor from the first part with a uniform strength of tone does not mean playing them monotonously, but declaiming them with simple and impressive pathos, avoiding sentimental effects, and trying to get all possible richness by the perfect shading of the normal forte. Within our Bach forte, we must get the relief of a piano and a forte, and a similar shading in the piano. Our mezzo forte is unknown to Bach. The sign MF is nowhere to be found in his music. He serves the link that binds piano to forte. On the other hand, as is proved by his markings in the scores of the cantatas, he distinguishes a pianissimo within the piano. A mezzo forte makes a Bach piece uninteresting. This holds good not only for the piano and the organ works, but for the orchestral concertos and the cantatas. If an orchestral piece does not make its effect, we may be sure that in half the cases this is the fault of a lack of character in the quality of tone employed. Unfortunately, our pianists and instrumentalists can get a mezzo forte, but neither a piano nor a forte that is rich and capable of gradation. For this reason, it is no unreasonable demand, curious as it may seem, that whoever wishes to interpret Bach must first of all learn how to play forte and piano. In Bach, however, the real essential thing is not so much the dynamic shading as the phrasing and accentuation. We soon realize this when we look at one of those precious orchestral scores which he has furnished with indications for performance. Seifert, in his fine essay on Praktische Bearbeitungen Bachscher Kompositionen, justly contrasts him in this respect with Handel. In Handel, he says, the care for dynamic effects is always uppermost. For the phrasing, he is satisfied with incidental hints. Bach gives extremely little in the way of dynamic suggestion, but he all the more carefully phrases the orchestral parts. Seifert's explanation of this difference, that Handel had at his disposal trained orchestral players, while Bach had only town musicians, is not convincing. The difference in the two methods is rooted in the dissimilarity of the men's music. Bach's works demand a characteristic and subtle phrasing of the themes and of the parts, on which the effect of the whole almost entirely depends. Handel's themes and passages, on the contrary, run more on the customary lines, and demand no such individuality of phrasing. In general, we may lay down the principle that in Bach every theme and every phrase must be delivered as if we were playing it on a bowed instrument. This holds good for the pianoforte, not less than for the woodwind instruments. We play the preludes and fugues of the well-tempered clavichord in accordance with Bach's intentions when we try to render them as if we were employing not a keyed instrument but a quartet or a quintet. The ideal must be to link the notes in such a way that they do not seem to be struck one after the other, but as if several bows were being simultaneously drawn over the strings. Bach's omission to record the phrasing and grouping in his clavier works is due partly to the fact that this was not customary at the time, the executive artist in our sense of the term being as yet unknown, and partly to the fact that the players he had in view were almost always his sons and his pupils, who were familiar with his principles. In the works for clavier with other instruments, there are often indications of the phrasing in the clavier part, Bach thinking it necessary that the clavier player should phrase precisely like the instrumentalists. Look, for example, at many movements in the violin sonatas, and among the clavier concertos, at the one in A major, No. 4. The greatest importance, however, attaches to the dots and ties in the orchestral parts of the Brandenburg concertos and of certain cantatas. A study of these will convince any one of the right way to phrase the clavier works. Legato playing, that is regarded as the characteristic of the Bach school, does not, as we observed in connection with the organ works, mean a uniform style of delivery, but implies an endless variety in the tying and grouping of single notes of equal value. 4 semiquavers are for Bach not 4 semiquavers, but the raw material for quite varied shapes, according to how he groups them, thus: or The last system of connection, that is almost universal elsewhere, is always subordinated by him to the other and more characteristic systems. He mostly groups the notes in twos when the second and third semiquavers have the same note in common. In these cases he always uses short ties, as if he were afraid of being misunderstood. Thus, on the very first page of the Italian concerto, The same grouping is also found in certain cases where none of the notes is repeated, but it is observable that here, as a rule, the melody moves in seconds. In the B minor fugue from the first part, Bach indicates this grouping by twos, as it did not seem to him quite self-evident. In this connection, it cannot be sufficiently insisted on that the second of the tied notes should be like a mere breath. A Bach connoisseur like Javert advocates writing such passages in this way. This accentual rule naturally holds only good for the normal case, in which the first of the two tied notes coincides with a stronger beat. In the opposite case, the second gets the strong accent, and the first counts as a preliminary. Prelude 20, second part. The rhythm in which the fourth note is attached from the first three appears in the presto of the Italian concerto, where Bach in addition plays a dot over the last note so as to ensure it being properly detached from the others. The combination most frequently met with, however, is that in which the last three notes are tied and separated from the first. Here again, Bach makes sure of the freedom of the first by means of a dot. Thus, at the commencement of the Italian concerto, in a longer succession of tied notes again, the first must be detached from the others. Bach phrases the presto of the Italian concerto sometimes thus. The dot only signifies that the note does not belong to the same group as those that follow. It is, however, closely bound to the preceding ones. In our notation, this is best expressed by including the detached note in the same tie as the previous note. Thus, Fugue in B flat, second part. Fugue in G major, second part. In the groups in triple time, again, the first beat is very often the second of a tied series, not the commencement of a new one. Bach's phrasing of the theme of the A major fugue from the first part would therefore be this. Even in pure triplets, it is in certain cases better to separate the second and third notes from the first, as if taking a light breath. The eighth bar of the B-flat major prelude from the second part should consequently be played thus. The phrasing is so frequent in Bach because his themes and figurations, even where the bar divisions do not indicate it to the eye, have generally an upbeat character, beginning with an unaccented note that leads into an accented one. It is a great mistake to play successive notes in his music with equal volume, in the style of Czerny's School of Velocity, or Clementi, or Kramer. There the essence of the legato phrasing is that we begin with an accented note and play the remainder as nearly as possible with the same weight. Bach's legato, however, is much less pianistic and much more vital. The large tie in his musical embraces numberless smaller ones that gather the notes into subordinate groups. Neither in his piano runs nor in his violin runs does he desire equivalence in the notes. Each has its relative value, namely, that belonging to it from its place in the tie. This can be explained on historical grounds. The monotonous legato that obsesses our pianoforte schools could only become after the passing under of the thumb had become recognized as the cardinal principle in playing. A legato of this kind was impossible so long as people simply passed the other fingers over and under each other, or merely moved the hand as a whole and fingered scale passages 3-4, 3-4, 3-4, or 5-4, 3-2, 2-1, as Bach tells his son to do in the Klavierübung. The ties of the second kind grew out of the style of fingering. For this reason, Bach's legato, compared with the usual pianistic legato, is as much richer and more varied as his fingering was richer and more diverse than ours. We must not imagine we are playing Bach with the right legato when we have worked out on paper all the passing unders of the thumb and the complicated interchanges of the fingers, and so make sure that every note will be properly sustained even to the last 100,000th of its value. The correct tying and fingering are those which bring out all the variety intended by Bach in the phrasing and the accents, that is, those which tell. The Bach staccato coincides only in rare cases with our light modern staccato. It is not so much a key pizzicato at the short and heavy stroke of a bow. Its effect is therefore to accentuate the note rather than to lighten it. It would be better indicated in our notation by a short stroke than by a dot. Long quaver or semi-quaver passages in staccato are rarely met with in Bach. When he separates the notes, it is only by way of a transient interruption of the legato, perhaps in passages like this. The semi-quavers between the two ties are to be played staccato, and this time lightly, not heavily. Certain indications in the orchestral parts make it probable that in the weakest beats of the 6/8 and similar times, when the motion is quite uniform, a light staccato is often indicated to break the legato. In general, however, the rule holds good that Bach's staccato does not run a uniform course, and that it is not light but heavy. An interesting case where he makes use of a staccato to accentuate a beat is found in the final allegro of the Clavier Concerto in A major. The transition here is in every respect so abrupt, especially as the orchestra enters on the trill, that the break must to some extent be put on the triplets. To play them with a light staccato would be to run the risk of negating Bach's intentions. The only rhythm that must always be given in staccato notes is that which Bach uses to express solemnity. We must detach the second note from the first, let it press forward toward the one that follows, and play it rather too heavily than too lightly, in order to preserve the impression of a somewhat formal solemnity of the kind that Bach wishes to suggest in many of his sarabands and gigs. Thus the bass of the F-sharp major prelude from the second part should be played thus. Nor should we be afraid to play whole pieces, such as the G minor prelude from the second part, if they are wholly in this rhythm, without a single really legato note. The rhythm and the variants of these demand a certain emphasis on the short notes, as if there were a fear of their passing unobserved. The shorter they are in actual time value, the more careful we must be to make them tell. In this way we can detach them somewhat from the main note and play them with a heavy staccato. For example, Well-Tempered Clavichord, Prelude 17, second part. Have we any means of knowing whether groups of notes are to be played staccato? In the first place, the staccato is required when the sequence is in characteristic or widely separated intervals. Under this first rule come all the themes that have anything of a springy motion. The best known example is perhaps the theme of the F major invention. The theme of the chorale fantasia, Jesus Christus unser Heiland, again from the third part of the Klavierübung, must be played staccato. The theme of the A minor fugue from the second part of the Well-Tempered Clavichord must be given thus. It seemed self-evident to Bach that the crotchets in this theme could only be rendered in this way. Some players, however, might have been in doubt as to whether to play the quaver legato or staccato. Bach therefore settled the matter by adding dots to the notes. He could not foresee that by doing so he would tempt the players of later generations to play the crotchets legato, as they have no dots, and to contrast the staccato quavers with them. The second rule for the employment of the staccato in Bach might be formulated somewhat thus: that any note interrupting a uniform motion at once steps out of the general tie embracing the preceding notes. The examples of this are innumerable. A typical one is the theme of the D minor fugue from the first part, in which Bach himself made the staccato point throughout the whole piece. Here indeed it becomes perfectly clear that the principle of the Bach phrasing is derived from an ideal bowing. This general rule, however, has one exception. The interrupting passage is only to be played staccato if it moves in a zigzag line. If it consistently ascends or descends in uniform and close-lying intervals, it must be played legato. There are thus two fundamental conceptions from which the whole of Bach's themes have sprung. The first is that of the differentiated ties. The second is that of the staccato as a rhythmic interruption of the legato. Therefore, the phrasing of the themes should not be left to the caprice of genius, but must be deduced from the ground rules of legato and staccato in Bach. Every player can acquaint himself with the typical combinations that arise from the differentiation of the ties and from the concurrence of legato and staccato, and can thus learn to bring out the various groups of which a Bach theme is composed. A few examples from the well-tempered clavichord may serve to elucidate these points. Themes consisting purely of differentiated ties. Prelude 20, Part 2. Fugue 6, Part 2. Fugue 10, Part 1. Prelude 5, Part 2. Prelude 2, Part 2. Themes combining legato and staccato. Fugue 2, Part 1. Fugue 21, Part 1. Fugue 16, Part 1. Fugue 1, Part 1. Fugue 15, Part 1. Fugue 11, Part 1. Fugue 5, Part 1. Fugue 12, Part 1. Fugue 7, Part 2. Closely bound up with the question of phrasing is that of accentuation. It is indeed solved by the right solution of the other. It has already been remarked in connection with ties that Bach's themes are mostly conceived as beginning with a large upbeat. The unaccented notes do not follow, but lead up to an accented note. Therefore, to play Bach rhythmically means accenting not the downbeat but the emphatic beat. With him, more than with any other composer, the bar divisions are only external divisions of the themes, the real meter of which cannot as a rule be represented in simple time species. The first to express this clearly was Rudolf Westphal in his metrical study of the fugues in common time in the well-tempered clavichord, in which he proves again and again that those who regard the bar lines in Bach's music as the borders of the rhythmic factors are bound to play him unrhythmically. In a Bach theme, everything urges forward to a principal accent. Till this comes, all is restless, chaotic. When it arrives, the tension relaxes, and at one stroke all that went before becomes clear. We understand why the notes had these intervals and these values. The chaos becomes order, the restlessness becomes peace. The theme lies before the hearer like a good coin, with the milling fresh and sharp. If, however, this emphasis is lacking, and in place of the note that is an integral part of the rhythm of the theme we accent strongly a note that belongs only to the bar rhythm, the unity and totality of the impression are destroyed. All he has in his hand is a coin of several pieces soldered together that keep falling asunder. This, of course, does not mean that in Bach the thematic accent and the bar accent never coincide. Cases of this kind, however, are more or less accidental. The superior vitality and lucidity given to Bach's music by throwing the main accent on the characteristic notes can be seen at once by anyone who makes a practical trial of it. Accenting according to the nature of the theme, instead of taking the phrases with the usual rise and fall, the final diminuendo, with all its shadings that we introduce into everything out of pure habit, is one of the direst enemies of stylistic Bach playing. The point can be best elucidated by reference to the theme of the E flat minor prelude. It is usually played thus. It should really go thus. If we play it in this way, the prelude, couched as it is in dialogue form, acquires a much finer inner coherence. To these indications for the accentuation of Bach's melodies, one is tempted to add another rule, that may seem extrinsic and imperfect, but which does good service in the majority of cases. According to this rule, we should primarily emphasize the notes at the end of the melodic line running in a certain direction, whether this is carried through in one piece or breaks off now and then and continues in separate segments. In the latter case, the end notes of each segment form preliminary accents that are meant to lead up to and culminate in the last and principal accent. It is just these themes build up in periods that are most often misunderstood. The following is a specimen of correct accentuation. Well-tempered clavichord, Fugue 11, Part 2. Here, as a rule, we do indeed hear the first two accents. The third, however, on the F, that ought to crown the others, is lost, and the theme runs about in the fugue like the poor ghost that carries its head under its arm. Fugue 17, Part 2. This case is similar to the foregoing. The average player resists the seductive appeal of the third beat for the first accent. He cannot, however, resist the first beat of the second bar. He respects the traditional rights of a note that occupies so important a position, and gives the A flat the accent that should be given to the D flat, without noticing that the succeeding semiquavers are no more than an ideal retardation of the passage of the D flat into the C. In the second place, a main accent must be given to the note that interrupts a melodic line more or less suddenly, whether the note be syncopated or not. As a matter of fact, in the majority of cases, it will happen either on a striking interval or on a syncopation. This sudden holding back is a characteristic feature of a number of Bach's themes. If we efface it by emphasizing the strong beats, we only torture the outline of the theme. But if we bring it out by proper accentuation, we reveal the great natural line that embraces this angular curve. We should therefore always emphasize with confidence any conspicuous interval or syncopation. This holds good even in matters of detail. In the B minor prelude of the first part of the well-tempered clavichord, the natural bar accent seems demanded by the regular quaver movement in the bass. If, however, we accent thus, it will immediately be followed that this rhythmical antagonism between the upper parts and even the bass is the very life of the prelude. It is unnecessary to say that here the emphasized notes are to be detached from the preceding ones. The following are types of themes that call for this syncopated accentuation. Fugue 19, Part 2. That the main accent here must be given to the last note, which on the first thought one would hardly venture to do, is provided by the further course of the piece, and especially its end. The two syncopations are thus only preliminary accents leading up to the third. Fugue 16, Part 2. Here the method of accentuation may be thought too venturesome, but with repeated playing it will finally seem more right than the more obvious accentuation on the first beat. A particular result of this syncopated accentuation is to give life to the otherwise monotonous 7 quavers on the same note. Fugue 8, Part 1. This theme clearly shows how little significance the bar divisions in Bach have for the thematic emphasis. That the consistent syncopated accentuation here is the only right one is shewn by the composer himself at the finish. As if he had sufficiently played with the performer and the hearer, he brings in the theme in augmentation in such a way that the syncopations fall on the strong beats. In the animated second subject of the Italian concerto, again, we can see how the syncopation deprives the neighboring strong beat of its accent. It is usually accented thus. This, however, does not bring out the essential principle of its structure. The correct way of phrasing is that in which the two syncopations act as preliminary accents leading up to the final accent. Thus, it may be objected that accentuation on these principles is too harsh and rough to be correct. It is, however, the only accentuation that does justice to the original character of Bach's themes. The hearer will not feel anything disagreeable in the sharp characterization they thus receive. He will only feel the truth and vitality of it. In any case, the fugues will now give him more enjoyment than before, as he will grasp the rhythmic essence of them instead of regarding them in the customary way as mere sequences of intervals. And it is quite certain that the cultivated hearer also pursues a theme in all its developments not as a sequence of intervals, but primarily as a succession of certain characteristic accents that bring with them the idea of the intervals associated with them. Reference has been made in the chapter on the organ works to the profound distinction between Bach's organ themes and his clavier themes. The former are almost always based on the principle of the accentuation of the strong beat, since it is impossible to bring out any other accent on the organ. It is even impossible to make one note stand out above the others. The possibility of this on the piano, if only in a limited way, is made use of by Bach to the utmost permissible limits. Both instruments again can individualize the tone much more even than the piano. The themes of Bach's instrumental works are much freer and bolder than those of the clavier works. Whatever force we give to the accent, the phrasing must be kept discreet and unobtrusive. In the last result, the whole phrase, with its varieties of ties and the staccati between them, must be embraced as it were in one large tie, which permits of diversity without restlessness. The hearer really should not be conscious of the phrasing as such. He must only be conscious of it as a self-evident and vital illumination of the whole down to the smallest detail, so that he is himself surprised at the ease with which he grasps this complicated polyphony. There is little to be said with regard to the tempo in Bach's clavier works. The better anyone plays Bach, the more slowly he can take the music; the worse he plays him, the faster he must take it. Good playing implies a fine phrasing and accentuation in every detail, in every voice. This of itself sets certain technical bounds to speed. On the other hand, in playing of the right kind, the hearer, even if the tempo is not quick in itself, has the feeling of it being quite fast enough, for the reason that at any quicker pace he could not grasp the detail. It should never be forgotten what a complicated process it really means for any musician, even for one who is not listening to it for the first time, to follow one of Bach's polyphonic works properly. Of course, if we are careless as to our phrasing and accentuation, and so obliterate the greater part of the detail, we can play faster with impunity, so as to give the music another interest of a kind. In general, however, the maxim holds good, that the vivacity of a Bach piece depends not on the tempo, but on the phrasing and the accentuation. In this sense, every one may strive to play him with plenty of temperament. The tempo marks, where they exist, should not be interpreted in a modern sense. Bach's adagio, grave, and lento are not so slow as ours, nor his presto so fast. Therefore we are easily betrayed into making his slow movements too long drawn, and of hurrying his fast ones. The circle of possible tempi in his music is a relatively narrow one. The question is really one of varied nuances on either side of a moderato. The presto of the Italian concerto is as a rule played twice as fast as it should be. Nobody will make this mistake who tries to realize the complicated system of ties that Bach has indicated in the movement. It goes without saying that the alla brave sign in Bach implies nothing as regards the tempo. It does not double the speed of the 4-crotchet beat. The ideal edition of Bach's clavier works would be a critically correct reprint of the original, in which the text is not adorned with ties and dynamic indications. It is hard to say how much mischief has been done by many of the old editions and arrangements. It would be something to establish the principle that the editor should indicate all editions of his own, so that the player who has not the original edition at hand may know what is and what is not by Bach and can use his own judgment. An inquiry among the piano-playing public would show that the majority have no idea that the ties and dynamic indications in their scores are not Bach's own. The best thing for our Bach editors to do would be to follow Busoni's example and publish not arrangements but their interpretations of the works. Busoni's edition of the Chromatic Fantasia, published by Simrock, is one of the finest achievements of this kind. That fascinates even those who cannot always see eye to eye with Busoni on the question of the permissible limits of modernization of Bach's music. It is to be hoped that Bülow's arrangement of this work is nowadays relegated to a bygone epoch of Bach interpretation. He himself would wish it to be so, were he alive now. Instructive editions of Bach's clavier works have this difficulty to contend with, that in half of them the text becomes unreadable by reason of the number of ties, staccato dots, and accents that are needed in order to give vitality of the phrasing. Perhaps future editors will adopt the plan of expressing their views in prefaces and footnotes instead of in the text. After all, the essential things are only the suggestion of the great dynamic lines and the phrasing and accenting of the themes. The details of the development of the work follow of themselves from these. Another advantage of editions of this kind would be that they could discuss various alternative phrasings instead of peremptorily thrusting one upon the player. It cannot be denied that many editions of piano music do not induce self-reliance, but the lack of it. This does more harm in the case of Bach's music than in any other. No one can play it satisfactorily who is not conscious of the essential principles of its musical structure. Perhaps even the copious fingerings that adorn our Bach editions are not so beneficial as is generally supposed, for they relieve the player of the trouble and the profit of working them out for himself. The rules for playing Bach's clavier works here elaborated are open to many objections. The view that the phrasing of the preludes and fugues of the well-tempered clavichord is primarily to be learned from Bach's own phrasing of orchestral parts will perhaps be thought too drastic. The rules as to accentuation may appear to lay too much stress on characterization. It will be objected that these dynamic rules insist too strongly on the architectonic side of the music. All this, however, does not in any way invalidate the rules. We may even regard it as a positive necessity to formulate general principles for performing Bach's clavier works, and it may be that these will coincide with the views of a number of our Bach pianists who are also in revolt against excessive and unintelligent modernization of the works, and believe that more is to be hoped for from a careful artistic enquiry than from self-satisfied caprice. The greater or less extent to which these views are adopted, however, is of little consequence. They will have fulfilled their object if they prompt players to more thorough reflection and a more careful examination of the works. In any case, no reader can be so conscious as the author that the framing of rules is more unsatisfactory and more imperfect in art than anywhere else. End of chapter 16. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Music performed from the source text available in the public domain by Jonathan Schofield, Birmingham, Alabama.